The Boko Haram insurgency has forced 2 million Nigerians to be internally displaced. That's according to Nigerian President Muhammadu Buhari, who was speaking on Monday at the UN Refugee Summit. Now, world leaders are congregated at the United Nations headquarters in New York to attend the General Assembly meeting that kicks off on Tuesday. In his speech at the summit, Buhari also laid out Nigeria's efforts to meet the needs of the internally displaced. At the same meeting, South African President Jacob Zuma said that the international community has to address many of these issues under development.
Discourse on refugees and migrants in the case of Nigeria will be incomplete without reference to our internally displaced persons, victims of Boko Haram's terrible atrocities. The Boko Haram insurgency has caused a huge refugee problem of an estimated 600,000 persons for Nigeria's neighboring nations. In Nigeria, over 2 million internally displaced persons from the northeast live in various camps across the country.
South Africa recognizes that in order to adequately address this challenge, we must address its root causes. Underdevelopment is a key driver of the displacement of people and in turn can lead to armed conflict. A concerted global effort to address the questions of underdevelopment and armed conflict should therefore be a central focus of all member states.
I thank the President.
Now, CCTV's Mimi Chiamen has been following up on developments in New York, and she joins us now live. Mimi, we know, of course, that the world is facing an unprecedented refugee and migrant crisis, but just talk us through some of the key factors that have prompted this first ever UN Refugee Summit.
Yes, as you say, currently the UN says that more people have been driven from their homes due to wars and persecution than at any other time since the agency's record keeping began after World War II. And the international response, the UN has said, has been inadequate. They projected in 2015 that over 900,000 refugees were in need of resettlement, and at the time only 81,000 had been resettled. And now the issue in Europe sweeping that continent has certainly brought that into piercing focus. In Syria, 4.8 million people have fled, 6.6 million are internally displaced, and it's certainly not isolated to that region. We're seeing refugee crises in Africa as well. In South Sudan, the refugee situation has surpassed the 1 million mark, and we heard from Kenya's Deputy President William Ruto speaking earlier at this summit, and he said that the burden has really been inadequately placed on developing nations. He noted that nothing can better demonstrate the failure of international burden sharing than this reality. It's also an indictment, he said, on the global framework for responding to human distress. Now, this summit really carries the weight of achieving a goal where they can evenly distribute among member states the responsibility for the world's refugees. And it's not just a question of the immediate problem, it's also a matter of posterity. As Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said, so many of these refugee children are going uneducated, and what that means for their future and the future of their countries is really an issue that the UN needs to help bring more into focus.
And of course, with some of those figures you were sharing with us just a moment ago, it's clear just how pressing the situation really is. And many are hoping that this summit will be more than just a talk shop. Mimi, how are resolutions arrived at this summit going to be applied, and will they be binding to all UN member states?
Well, what's going to come out of this summit is what they call an outcome document. It's going to be called the New York Declaration. So that's not a binding document. And that has already been criticized by several observers and several NGO officials, saying that the language has really been softened. And that's because the document still needs to secure the backing of member states. But in one example, a clause on the detention of refugee children, rather than saying that detention of refugee children should be prohibited, prohibited, instead says it is seldom, if ever, in the best interest of the child to be detained. And now that is certainly causing a lot of discomfort, especially as we hear amidst the U.S. election talks of what will happen to policy on immigrants and refugees. But President Obama is going to hold his own summit on migrants, and that is going to come tomorrow. And that's where observers say some more substantive pledges are likely to come out of. In today's case, it is really more of a symbolic document, but observers say that that's noteworthy in and of itself, that the UN has chosen to take this focus and use that to kick off the 71st session of the General Assembly. Back to you.
Well, indeed, lots of attention will be on the outcomes of this first ever UN Refugee Summit. Thank you very much, Mimi Chairman, live for us there in New York.